already work with loads of Chinese families.
So let's give this talk to Leslie.
Yeah. And in fact, I should have titled it Changing Dynamics in College Admissions for Asian Students, but it applies, what changed in college admissions really applies to all the racial groups. Anyways, 2021 is recognized by everybody in my business as the most difficult admission season in history, okay? With record low numbers of admits to all of the top tier schools and all of the popular middle tier schools, such as BU and George Washington. So it was also recognized as a fantastic year for African American, Native American, and Hispanic Latino students, particularly at top tier schools. It has not been printed in all of the write-up information, but if more Black, Latino, and Native American students were admitted, it means that fewer Asian students were admitted. And that information is not being printed, but it's pretty obvious to anybody who's in my business. So the rules of college admissions have changed quite dramatically as of last year. And COVID circumstances were responsible, particularly for the SAT, ACT optional status, which was actually a negative for Asian students, in my opinion, okay? It was an extreme positive for Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. All of the top tier schools have been in outreach programs for several years for more students from those groups, but they were hamstrung in bringing more in primarily because of low scores. So, all right, I just wanted to review the application options and terms before we go forward. And for those of you that have already sent some children to college, you're probably familiar with these terms, but for those of you that haven't, they can become rather confusing initially. So early action is a non-binding application mode. And unfortunately, not every school, in fact, not even really many schools offer early action. So early action allows you to apply as of November 1st in a student's senior year. And you can receive your notification as to whether or not you're accepted, rejected, or deferred to regular decision, usually before Christmas, mid-December. So that's significantly earlier than the notification date for regular decision, which is end of March, beginning of April. So if you are accepted to one of your early action schools, you do not have to accept, you do not have to apply. Early decision 1 and 2. Early decision 2 is relatively new. Early decision 1 means that you can apply to ideally it's your first choice school as of November 1, and again, receive the news that you're hopefully accepted, rejected, or deferred to regular decision, again by mid-December. Early decision 2 gives you a second option at early decision, and those applications are due January 1st, which is the same date that most of the regular applications are due. So early action and early decision are very advantageous for colleges because it allows them to lock in a significant number of their class. So although early decision is a binding agreement, you must attend if you are accepted, you can get out of it by claiming that your financial aid package is not sufficient or that your financial circumstances have changed. I don't urge people to go forward with an early decision that way. Um, it's it's one of the most important application means for a student, and students usually have about a 30% higher chance of being accepted early decision than regular decision. So early action restrictive, very few schools use this. Sometimes it's called single choice early action. The schools that do are Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, MIT. Um, and it's somewhat of a misleading term. Um, it's more like an early decision in that you can only apply to one school early decision. You can only apply to one school early action restrictive. But if you get in, you do not have to attend. And I guess MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale are also confident that you'll go if you get in, that they don't have to make it mandatory. So accepted, rejected, or pretty clear cut. Deferred to regular decision. It means your application will be reassessed with the regular decision pool. From the regular decision pool, again, you can be accepted, rejected, or deferred acceptance. A lot of schools will offer you the opportunity, in fact, Harvard does this quite a bit, to attend the following year, commencing the following September, to take a year off, gap year, or waitlisted. At the most selective schools, very few students come off the wait list, although I did have one come off an MIT wait list. And he's already graduated from MIT and he's in an MIT graduate program now. And actually, I have a little data information on him further on in this presentation. This year's waitlist, by the way, has been extremely active. That's been another sort of game-changing scenario. Okay, so here's what happened this year. Record-breaking early decision applications to top and middle tier schools. So early decision applications to MIT were up about 62% and to Harvard about 59%. BU about 24%, Tufts, I think it was like 35 or 36%. So this was extraordinary. And unfortunately, it resulted in the early decision option being less of an advantage. It was not a 30% better chance for admittance to most of these schools. And the acceptance rates plummeted. So acceptance rates at Harvard, MIT, and Stanford are all below 4%, extremely low. And this score optional SAT, ACT status is what drove this. And the other sort of false belief, and I heard this from many of the parents that I worked with this past year, that the fact that they were not seeking financial aid, they felt would give them a significant advantage in an unstable economy. Ironically, more low-income students were accepted than ever before this past year. So the apple cart was very much upset in terms of expectations. A lot of parents said, well, my kid is not a great test taker, and without having to submit a score, I think that will be an advantage for him or her. So let's use our early decision option on Harvard. Why not? Let's give it a try. Turned out to be a very foolish move for a lot of students because most of the students who were accepted to Harvard submitted a score, except for a large percentage of African-American, Hispanic, and Latino students. All right, standardized testing. This information was taken from the College Board. The College Board is the organization that writes and administers the SAT. So we know that this is completely accurate. Notice that Asian students by far score higher than any other racial group. So you'll understand how race factors in college admissions. Asian students and their scores are compared against those of other Asian students. African American students and their scores are compared against other African American students, so forth and so on. So also of the same gender too. So Asian girls are their scores are compared to other Asian female applicants, and so on. So every school has a general score threshold, and traditionally it has been higher for Asians, which was what prompted the Harvard lawsuit, and lower for African Americans, and variations all the way down. So I talk a lot about SAT in this presentation because the SAT provides more data, but I wanted to point out that the ACT is actually the more popular test. More students take the ACT than the SAT. Both tests are viewed equally in college admissions offices. There is no preference. And most educators, including myself, prefer the ACT. We feel it's a more fair and user-friendly exam. So anyways, this is a concordance which compares the ACT and SAT scores. You can find it in numerous places through Google. Okay, so another phenomenon that happened due to the optional status of standardized testing is that those students who handed in a score were all students who scored extremely well. So the average score at Boston University, BU, went up a whopping 76 points on the SAT and 2 points on the ACT. So many of the Ivy League schools had previously cited a 33 as an average ACT score. In fact, it's still on the University of Pennsylvania website. But now that appears to be an average at BU. So essentially, the score bar has been risen significantly. So in fact, I had a Asian student who was waitlisted at UPenn, and he didn't have a score. I pushed him to test again, and he got a 32, and I advised him not to submit it because there were too many Asian students submitting 34s, 35s, and 36. So anyways, the score optional status backfired in a number of ways with respect to mid to upper income Asian and white students. Okay, it's sort of disadvantaged them going forward. By the way, next year's admission season, which essentially commences November 1st, 2021, will be score optional at almost all of the same schools. So, okay. Standardized testing, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Some other sort of landmark changes in standardized testing, the elimination of the SAT and ACT essay sections. I'm all for that. I never liked those essay sections anyways. And students struggled with them, and they required quite a bit of additional preparation. So that's good news for all students. SAT subject tests discontinued. That's not the best news for high achieving students, because it just gave high achieving students another window to submit a lot of strong tests. Some of my students from China have never done particularly well on the SAT or ACT English and reading sections. I always advise them to take a lot of subject tests to sort of balance off a lower score. The ABCs all do fine because they're native speakers, but students who come here later, especially in ninth grade, frequently struggle with the English sections. The test optional trend, you can look at all the schools that are test optional, many of them, including some very competitive schools like Bowdoin and Wake Forest, have been test optional for years. Right, the University of California's school system has completely discontinued use of the SAT and the ACT, and they cited it as a racist exam. Both of them as racist exams, which is their explanation as to why there's such a big gap in racial scores. So they're currently designing their own test system, and they will not accept or consider SAT or ACTs going forward. That includes Berkeley. Okay, AP tests are becoming increasingly important. That's a little bit tricky because some schools don't offer many AP tests to juniors. And by the time you're taking an AP test at the end of your senior year, you're already into college. So you don't have the advantage of being able to submit that score. So look for AP classes where you can put your juniors where you think they're probably going to excel. Okay, so these are the standardized testing score ranges at highly selective schools. These are overall not racial based scores. In fact, if you want to understand more about scores, I urge you to go to the MIT website. MIT has compared to the Ivy League, is much more transparent with their information. And you can go to first year profile and scroll through and see score ranges that all of their kids had come in on. So MIT has traditionally had a very large Asian population and a minute African American population. I know that changed this past year, and we'll see what happens next year too. So anyways, moving back. All right. So standardized tests have become increasingly racialized. Okay. And different standards are expected now for different races. So in my opinion, mid to upper income Asian and white students should not go test optional, with some exceptions. If it is a student who tests very, very poorly, that needs to be considered. But usually that's not a student who's applying to a top tier school. So they become increasingly racialized. And for African Americans and Latino, Hispanic, Native American, yes, score optional is probably the way to go. For white and Asian, it's not. So I realize it's not fair, but college admissions have never been fair. Okay, so students are being admitted from high schools that had no prior history with those schools. In fact, there was an article in the Boston Globe about this. So if students are admitted from, say, Dorchester High School, maybe not as many are being admitted from Newton, Wellesley, Weston, Lexington High School. So it's a logical deduction to make. Okay, so in keeping with that too, there are new rules for admittance to Boston exam schools for those of you who are from the greater Boston area. There were a lot of Asian students going to Harvard through Boston Latin, and that's all being limited. Okay. New directions for extracurricular profiles. I've been talking about that for a long time with my Asian clients, and it's becoming more and more important going forward. And I'm going to do another presentation entirely on that at a to be determined date. Okay, so there were significant increases in admittance of low income and underrepresented minority. Some of these come under categories that a lot of people aren't familiar with, like first generation college category. That means that the student and or his siblings are the first children in the entire family to ever attend college. Questbridge and Pell Grant students, these are for low income students of promise, and it's a largely minority group. This year, much longer and more active wait lists, which the colleges hate. They're running a business and they want to lock in on their student body as soon as possible and meet the criteria that they've designated for their student body. And with so many students having applied to more schools than in the past, it was extremely difficult for this past season for colleges to fill their classes. So more international applicants under the Biden administration are anticipated. Last year, we had, due to COVID, probably Trump politics combination, fewer applicants from Asia, significantly fewer. Chinese students from China with Chinese passports are the largest international student group in the United States and have been for a number of years. Okay, so this is my opinion here, the typical Chinese and ABC profile. And I've shown it to a lot of my colleagues and they all agree. So, but one of my families that I'm working with now has informed me that hockey is becoming very popular with Asian families, and that fencing is so yesterday, according to her. So I don't know, maybe that's something new. And on the bottom, that's a quote that I took from the Chinese consortium lawsuit against Harvard. And so this is an extremely typical Asian profile. And there are exceptions always. So number one, this student who went to Harvard, he was, well, is a pianist. But like many Asian students who play classical music, play an instrument, whatever, he was not just good, he was outstanding. He really was a superstar and performed at Carnegie Hall and Jordan Hall. So, and actually he's since changed from computer science to statistics. All right, the boy at MIT, I'll give you all a little tip. For anybody who has a student that excels in math, the Promise program, which is listed below, I've worked with several Asian students who went to the Promise program, and it's a huge feeder to the Ivies, a lot of them at Princeton and Brown and MIT. However, it's a very difficult program to get into, and you have to be recommended and you have to know about the program. I'm convinced a lot of people don't know about it. If you go to the site online, you'll see an awful lot of Asian and Indian faces in the program. Highly recommended. So again, he had a somewhat typical profile with the exception of the autism aspect. His sister was autistic, and he presented a book about autism to Michelle Obama, which is kind of cool. But otherwise, his profile was pretty typical, but he excelled, just as the Harvard student excelled in music. This girl on the left, she actually just graduated from Duke. And Duke, by the way, had the same acceptance rate as Yale this past year, hovering around 4%. Duke's always been an extremely popular school with Northeastern kids. So she had a perfect score in the English sections, Um, I've had loads of Asian students with perfect scores in math, and far fewer with perfect scores in English, which is a harder section statistically on the SAT and the ACT anyways. But she was into art and English and writing. So sort of an atypical profile. And same with this boy who went to Brown. He had a phenomenal ACT score for an immigrant. So he came here in ninth grade. A fantastic score. Anyways, he was an artist as well. And the U Chicago boy, he got an A in basically leadership. And he had a tremendous number of leadership roles, which don't emerge that much in the Chinese community. I've had very few kids involved in Chinese kids who are involved in student government and things like that. So he had a lot of leadership in diverse areas. And the Stanford girl, the Harker School in California was built, designed as a feeder school to Stanford, just as Noble and Greeno used to advertise itself back in the day when my stepfather and uncle were there as a feeder school to Harvard. So nobody would make those claims today. But in any event, it's filled with the children of tech entrepreneurs. And it's about 40% Asian and 40% Indian, the entire school, and extremely competitive. So those are some of profiles of kids I've worked with, but I'm seeing some changes and I'm urging kind of changes. So if a student has tremendous talent, even if it's in a traditionally Asian pursuit, such as classical music or math, terrific. Make sure that that talent is demonstrated somewhere. You can't really mold a child in a certain direction unless there's some level of passion or interest, from what I've observed, or talent for that matter. So they're looking for extracurricular profiles that either demonstrate talent, passion, initiative. Leadership is a big one, and now empathy is becoming one of the bigger buzzwords, and I'll show you why in one of the next slides. Think big and start early. You cannot build a compelling extracurricular profile starting in 10th grade. Ninth grade's even a little bit late. And think big. Okay, I'm working with a student now who started an online e-commerce business, and he's made an extraordinary amount of money in a relatively small period of time. And I'm starting to think about Stanford for him because although he's only in ninth grade, Stanford favors these sort of entrepreneurial kids. They've got a reputation of taking entrepreneurs. And I'm working with him now to try and find an appropriate service component to his business. So he started early enough, and we've got enough time to really build this. Okay, making caring common project. You can find a lot of information about this project online. Making caring has an empathy, community service for others. So about 50 of the top tier schools participated in this program, and admissions officers are now deeming this demonstrated concern and action towards the welfare of others. Others can be people, animals, or the planet, climate issues. Has a very desirable profile, okay? And they're looking for more of that. And in a lot of the write-ups that individual schools, Dartmouth in particular, wrote about how so many of the students that they accepted were already or poised to become impactful civic leaders. So you can Google this up and read more about it, but this is a strong new direction that admissions is moving towards with respect to the student profiles that appeal to them. And certainly the Black Lives Matter movement has sort of fanned the flames on this. So it's worth reading about and becoming familiar with it. So these are the kind of kids that admissions officers are looking for. Kids that are changing their communities and potentially our world, okay? Effecting positive change. So I'm showing this to all of my new students. These are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As I look to kids to try and find an area that intrigues them where they can try and make a difference. And this is beyond the whatever community service requirements a school may have. I'd like to see kids show some leadership in the service arena and some initiative to come up with some ideas on their own. So last but not least, I've always found my Asian families interested in standardized testing. And I feel that frequently the importance of the college essay is overlooked. I should say college essays. There's one main essay, and then there are numerous additional supplemental essays. The essay writing process is very time consuming, and any and all of the schools that your kids may attend all recommend that students start the process the summer before senior year. These college essays cannot be written in a weekend. They're extremely important, and you should receive assistance. If not from somebody like me, an English teacher. Kids should not just be left on their own to write these essays and submit them. They're incredibly important within the decision-making process. So what's going to happen going forward? Well, nobody could have really predicted what happened this past year. In fact, a lot of predictions went in the opposite direction. Again, my higher income families who said, we're finally going to get our chance. We will have an advantage because we're full pay. And again, more low income students than ever were accepted. So anyways, there will be increased importance of very well thought out application strategies and college lists. Okay, I've heard several stories from 3 of my students who all attend one of the most competitive high schools, public schools in the greater Boston area, that there were 2 kids, one Asian, one white, who applied early decision to an Ivy, and they were deferred to regular, and at the end of the day, they got in almost nowhere. And one is going to a lower tier school that was, a safety, and the other is hoping and praying that they'll get off a wait list to Cornell. So some bad things did happen this past year, and their application strategies didn't work. So it's extremely important that the college list and the application strategies is well thought out. Indicating major and minor or career directions in an application has also become increasingly important. Now, students can always change their mind, so it's not like you're committing to be a doctor forever. You get into college, you take organic chemistry, and you decide it's not for you. You can change your mind, but somewhere in the application, this should be indicated. the comment I made about considering to consider how this is associated with gender race profiles. Women, females in STEM have a big advantage. Asian men in STEM do not. One of my students from last year, female, she was number one in her class, and Latina is at Stanford as a young engineer. So in any event, consider the associated gender race profiles, particularly if the students coming in with not much more than good grades and good scores. If there isn't much of a extracurricular profile that backs up the career direction or major and minor direction. Strong standardized test scores. They've got to be stronger than ever, really, for Asian students. For ACT, depending on what schools we're looking at, somewhere in the 30s for all of them. For SAT, again, depending on what level school we're looking at, I like sort of 1400 and above. More like 1500 for super selectives. Okay, desirable extracurricular profiles. A student must excel in something, and that excelling must be demonstrated in some way. And you can't just say, oh, my son or daughter is a fantastic writer unless they've won some awards or been accepted to some prestigious writing programs. Okay, there has to be some demonstration, some mark of excellence. And if it's not a talent, then I'd like to see kids gear their extracurricular profiles more towards service. Okay, superior application essays, can't stress that enough. Demonstrated interest in the college list, with students not being able to tour colleges this past year. All of the colleges created very well done marketing videos. And it was vitally important that students attend those videos, even if they live next door to the college or had siblings at the college or had toured the college a year prior. So demonstrated interest became increasingly important in admissions offices. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty in admissions offices about who out of the students that they accepted were actually going to attend. So these are the trends that are very obvious so far. There may be more that develop as the year unfolds. So I'm offering several summer programs that I'll be running, and I have some great staff members who will be working with me. And on the SAT and ACT, I'm going to focus on the most difficult questions and strategies. And we will also work extensively on learning how to craft an outstanding college application essay, both the main essay and the supplemental or school-specific essays. And students will leave with some viable topics and an understanding of how it's done. I also am going to do a short writing workshop closer to the commencement of school for students from 7th to 10th grade. Writing is universally viewed as one of the weaker areas that students have. And I feel that your average student, or even outstanding students, that their writing skills don't really fully develop until they're in college. And any boost on writing skills will be reflected in grades and efficiency in school. So on an ongoing basis, we offer all kinds of individualized or private educational services, application essay, and Lily had mentioned private secondary school and college, but we also do graduate programs. I mean, I've done all kinds of graduate programs, and I have somebody working with me now who went to Harvard Business School, and she's been doing a fantastic job on a lot of MBA programs. So the extracurricular profile workshop, I'm going to address that issue in greater length at an upcoming Zoom. And I invite you to come, and I will have a question and answer session afterwards. And it really is geared towards parents of elementary school children and, up to 9th grade. By the time we're in 10th or 11th, it's really hard to change directions or add much that's compelling. But, for parents who are curious, you're certainly welcome to attend, even if your children are in 10th or 11th grade. Sometimes it's just reassuring to know that you're on the right track. So that concludes our program for today. I'm going to flip back to some of the graphs, just in case you want to make some notes. I do urge you to read about the Making Caring Common project on the internet. Some of the case studies, kids I've worked with, all Asian students, all Chinese specifically. The standard profile, emerging trends, standardized test scores. It's interesting to look at, if you look at this, the average math scores, okay? They're all extremely high, okay? All in the 99th percentile, essentially. And you look at this slide, looks like all of those schools should be nothing but Asian students, doesn't it? So it's interesting. So there's a lot you can extrapolate from looking at that data and at this graph in terms of who got in under score optional. And all of these numbers have been published by the universities themselves, the surge in early decision applications. So many schools have put that data out. Stanford notoriously doesn't like to share data. So I haven't seen any Stanford data about their early decision application numbers. So that's been our game-changing year. And I and many of my colleagues anticipate a similar year next year. So wishing you and your students all the best of luck, and be happy to speak with any of you about specific questions going forward. So if any of you do have questions, I urge you to send them to Weston Ivy, and I look forward to hearing from many of you. So thank you for attending, and I hope you found this elucidating on the frequently very mysterious process of college admissions in the United States. Thanks for coming, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, Leslie, since you're here, do you want to take some questions?
Yeah, if you can if you put some questions in the chat feature, I can answer them. Okay. Let's see. And I am on WeChat as well. And I will also put in my personal email address in the chat in case you have a question that you think of later. So any questions for anybody?
Maybe we give like 5-10 minutes if you have any questions.
All right. Do you provide consulting services? Sure. Yes, I definitely do. And in fact, I've had a lot of kind of students that I start working with in 9th grade, and I guide them through the entire high school process. And then I also work with some students just on the application essays and some just on test prep. It varies. So, but the answer is yes. Let's see, I put my email there and I
Okay.
am on WeChat. And I'm friends with Lily on WeChat. And my cartoon face on WeChat, I look very blonde, so I stand out. Major difference between SAT and ACT, that's a very good question. The major difference is twofold. Timing. So the SAT moves much slower and the ACT moves very quickly, which for students who speak English as a second language, the ACT reading section is, it's usually a little too fast. However, I have had students who were not even particularly high achieving students who didn't find the ACT to be too fast. The ACT reading section is by far easier than the SAT reading section. The ACT also contains a science question, a science section. And students do not need to be good in science to do well in the section. In fact, the science section on the ACT is most closely related to an IQ test, and science is the topic that is used. So whether they're talking about, I don't know, genetics or outer space, whatever topic they're referring to in science, they give students all of the data they need. So it doesn't matter if a student has had physics or biology yet in order for them to do well. So those are the biggest differences. Now, for students who require additional time, students who have, say, ADD or any learning difference, it's much more difficult to get extra time on the ACT than on the SAT. And the college scandal from a few years ago has made it even more difficult. So if your child does require extra time and has been diagnosed with ADD or a learning difference, you want to get on that process early. It takes months for them to process that. And I have saw an instance this past year of a student who did get extra time on the SAT, and she definitely should have had it on the ACT and did not receive it. And the psychologist who diagnosed her wrote a scathing letter directed to her school and the ACT for not giving it to her. But in any event, she's going to go test optional, but she's also not, this is a white student, but she's not applying to super top tier schools. So in any event, it's something to start thinking about early, like probably in 10th grade before 11th grade comes around. Most of the testing that students do, they do in 11th grade. I have had some students who got to the end of junior year and hadn't tested yet. It was a very big mistake. So 11th grade is the year to start. If you want to understand how your student is as a tester, there's all kinds of sample tests you can find online or through the Real ACT book or the official College Board SAT workbook. I don't suggest taking an official test before 11th grade because every test score that is official is submitted. Colleges can see all scores, so it doesn't really work to your advantage. However, due to super scoring, only the highest and best scores from each section will be factored into the admissions decision. So I think I covered it, but if anybody has any more questions, please type them in about the SAT and the ACT. Preparation does work, by the way, and there are many ways to do it. There have been studies that the average increase is 100 points or more on the SAT, and I think it's 1 to 2 points on the ACT with test prep, which is why Obama got behind the creation of Khan Academy to provide free test prep information to lower income students. So in any event, test prep does work, and it's a good idea to get on that bandwagon early. And it can be done in a number of different ways, class, private, or even self-study. There aren't too many kids who are going to self-study because it's sort of an overwhelming task. But I'm aware of some who have. And in any event, no student should walk in and take the test cold just to get a baseline. You can get a baseline with a practice test, and it won't go into your permanent record. Any other questions?
Leslie, can we see the first 3 slides again? Kind
Sure.
of quick earlier, just the first couple. First.
Oh, you want to look at my picture again? I'm just joking. Let's see, I already went out of it. Let me pull it back up. Oh, here we go. Okay. First 3. Okay. All right, so yeah, I did probably go over this pretty quickly. Give you all a minute to read it.
Okay, and then the next 2 were also related to.
This was just an overview of the different application modes that are available to students. Many parents applied to college under just one mode, regular decision. And since then, there have been a lot of additions. By the way, based on what happened this past year, a number of schools have added an early decision 2 option. So there's early decision 1, those applications go in November 1st. And early decision 2, those applications go in January 1st, approximately, which is the same time that regular decision applications go in. Early action, those go in November 1st. You can apply to as many of those as you'd like. There aren't many schools, unfortunately, that offer early action options. Of the more competitive schools that offer early action, several of what we call the public Ivies. These are outstanding state schools like University of Michigan, University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, all offer early action. Northeastern offers early action. In fact, Northeastern, if you go to their admissions page, they've been very outspoken about how they're encouraging students to apply early action or early decision. So these are all early decision applications, or in the case of Harvard and MIT, early action restrictive or single choice early action. These numbers the early decision application numbers had remained constant for, I don't know, for years. And this was a huge upset, these numbers. And this phenomena was reported about in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times regularly. You can sort of Google around and see a lot of articles about what was going on. Okay. And then the standardized test, the highest possible SAT score you can get is 800. So the very far right of the graph. Once a student is in the 750 to 800 range, they're in the 99th percentile in terms of overall test takers. Another sort of interesting fact about the SAT and ACT is that only 1/10 of 1%, 1/10 of 1% of the students who take these tests every year get a perfect score. A perfect score on the SAT would be 1600, and a perfect score on the ACT is 36. So it's extremely low percentage of students who get a perfect score. And the math section is, I'm not going to say the easiest, but that's the highest scoring section statistically. The reading and English sections are lower scoring sections overall. So that's sort of interesting. And again, one last time, these are assessed racially. It's funny because we live in a society where nobody likes to talk about things like that, but in college admissions, it's discussed freely. And so, yes, these Asian students who are getting 750s to 800s are scoring vastly higher than the other groups, the other three groups listed, but they're being assessed against other Asian students, not against the other groups listed. So any other, well, I'll just go through the rest of them. The concordance is just to show you what a 36 means relative to an SAT and vice versa. Because again, the ACT is the more popular test and has been for about 10 years, maybe more now. So this was considered rather stunning, this data here that I put into this box, this slide here. And only 44% of students submitted SAT or ACT scores. And I strongly believe, and it's pretty obvious to extrapolate, that the vast majority of those students were Asian or white. So, and if there are any particular schools that interest you, or schools you attended yourself, or that your children may be interested in, a lot of them did write-ups of their extraordinary application years, and you can Google them up on a school by school basis. Some didn't, or maybe they haven't printed anything yet, but there's a lot of information out there. And they all talk about how they had record numbers of, the new term is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, which is a little bit misleading because there were not record numbers of Asians admitted, but, and this is a big but, Harvard admitted more Asians according to their data than typical, but I believe that's a backlash from the lawsuit. And so in any event, so University of California school system, this means too that if your student is going to apply to the California school system, in addition to other schools, there'll be an additional test that he or she will have to take. Now, they're currently designing it, and I don't expect it to be ready for a couple of years. But in any event, there'll be an additional test for students. And it's too bad that the SAT subject tests were discontinued. It seems counterintuitive to me that they were discontinued because they weren't mandatory. And so it was an advantage to students who test well to have that option. But anyways, they've been discontinued. So here again these are rough numbers. These are what they print on their own websites. 25th percent, meaning that these are kind of the ranges. And there are students that fall outside of those ranges, some recruited athletes, and again, certain minorities. But these are pretty realistic. Okay, has score range for top tier schools. And I have seen some outstanding students score below their capability, primarily because of test anxiety. I've never seen a student score, I don't know, above what I would have expected their potential to be. Never, ever. I mean, I've never seen, say, a straight B student in the 99th percentile on a test. So in that regard, they do sort of accurately reflect high achieving students. They do. For anybody interested in what's happening with the Boston exam schools, there was an article in the Boston Globe about it recently. And Boston Latin in particular has an agreement with Harvard that goes back, I don't know, I think to the school's inceptions, that a certain number of students from Boston Latin, it's either 21 or 22 per year, be accepted to Harvard. So a lot of Chinese and Chinese American families moved to West Roxbury to get into the Boston exam system. Anyways, now they're changing the rules because they'd like to see more Black and Latino students at Boston Latin. So, yeah, it's like I said, things aren't really necessarily fair, and in the interest of diversity. So,
Okay, I think
any other slides that anybody wants to take another look at? Okay, I'll just go through to the very end. And I do urge you to all read about that Making Caring Common initiative. So, all right, anything else? I think that's it then. All right, well, you can always email additional questions to Weston Ivy. And in fact, it's better that you send them there because I will be traveling next week. So I think that covers it for today. I thank you all for coming, and we'll notify you when we're going to do the extracurricular profile workshop. And you might want to tell some of your friends with younger children about that one. I'm sure it's going to be very eye-opening for a lot of people. All right, well, thank you for joining me on this rainy afternoon. And I hope we can add some value to your students' lives going forward. Thanks very much.
thank you, Leslie.
Thanks, Lily.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.